Welcome to day 13 of me cycling northern Spain. Today I'm going to be on the seafood coast in Galicia, leaving Carino and arriving in San Cibrao. I met some big lumber lorries on the way on this route, not very pleasant. But this day is also a day of a slightly entertaining error in that I'd emailed the owner of the hostel the previous night saying I'd be there at 2:30 because I thought I'd only 50 kilometres to cycle. Instead, I had nearly 80, including 1,300 metres of climbing. So rather than doing the sensible thing and mailing them a second time and say, hey, I'm actually going to be a bit later than I thought, I decided I would just stick to schedule and plough through. Now, in a way, that's a shame because there's a couple of points it would have been nice to have the time to divert off. I'll talk about a couple of things that are just off the route once we get to those appropriate bits. And it also meant that I was leaving in the rush hour traffic, which was relatively busy. This, by the way, is a road I did not take because my map sent me down there, but I thought that was just a little bit too rough, and instead I kept going and took a turn off that's coming up here on the left. Now, interestingly enough, there is a cycle lane marked on my map if you stay on the main road, but actually I think this back route I took in is very much prettier, and then at one point brings you down alongside the river before crossing into the next town. And also, as you can see here, no traffic at all. Very typical Galician cart road again, which are these roads that basically used to be cart roads and just got surfaced. And then after this, it's up into the mountains and away from the coast. As in a lot of places, the actual coast road tends to be quite busy. So it's often better to be just a couple of kilometres back from the coast in the kind of back roads that go through. Now, in this particular case, I'm coming on and off. And you'll note there's a railway there beside me. Now, we're going to cross that railway multiple times, and that's the railway I've talked about yesterday, as well as if you didn't want to do such distances yourself, but you wanted to go through the same areas. It's a light rail with an awful lot of train stops that's frequently close to where I'm cycling. You'll see me cross over it, and actually also they frequently have a cycle route running alongside it, as is the case here. And as far as I know, it's easy enough to get bikes on and off it because it's a short distance, slow railway, basically. So it would definitely be an option if you wanted to do this in a slightly easier way than what I did it. So this attractive set of back roads are basically following the bay around that runs between the two most northwesterly of the capes of Galicia. And the second one of these, which is Ponte Metalico, is in fact more northerly than Metalico, which I was on yesterday. It sticks out a bit further north into the Bay of Biscay. And I'll have a bit of a story about that as we get closer to it. But there's a whole set of fine beaches and another small fishing village that unfortunately I had to skip over because of my own foolish deadline setting as you're going through here. And as you'll see, it is quite hilly terrain. This sometimes catches people by surprise with coastlines. They expect coastlines to be very flat, but in fact in Ireland in particular, but also in Galicia, you get an awful lot of these coastlines that are basically eroded mountains, with the result that it's going very, very up and down. Flat coastlines tend to be points where you get deposits at estuaries rather than erosion of cliff faces. And of course, the places that are very exposed to the Atlantic tend to be the places where you get cliff face erosion and those coastlines that involve going up and down a lot. And that's true even of the east coast of Ireland as well. I'm considering doing France next year. And that a lot of that coastline is a lot flatter because it's a coastline formed from deposits. Anyway, so the story about the Cape Estaca de Barres I'm going to tell is actually from 1943, November the 10th to be specific, and it's a U-boat story because German U-boats used to lie in wait off the coast here to ambush Allied shipping coming through, but by 1943 the Allies were doing very strong protective work using planes with radars that would pick up the U-boats and bomb them. So this U-96 was attacked by a RAF Wellington first of all, and then by US Navy B-24 Liberators. And then later that day, another Liberator, this time with the Czechoslovakian crew, sighted it again as it headed for the neutral Spanish coast at full speed. But they attacked it with wing-mounted semi-armour piercing rocket projectiles, and that did enough damage to the sub, even though a lot of them didn't explode apparently, that it then limped in even further to the coast at a speed of 6 to 8 knots. And then within about 200 knots of the coast, it slowed to 2 knots before running aground with 42 of her 50 crew surviving. They scuttled her in the Bay of Biscay off Porto de Berries, and will be going through Porto de Berries very shortly, after several depth charges attacks had also damaged her. Brief interruption of the story here for the first of my encounters with the lumber lorries as I go through these eucalyptus plantations. This one went down that way, and then a couple of minutes later either it or another one came back up the other way. As you can see, there's really no room on these roads for passing, but the thing is, because there's no other traffic, I did hear them coming a long way away, so I was able to get out of the way. Back to the submarine story. So the commander of that submarine returned to this coast apparently on the anniversary of the sinking every year, and when he died, his ashes were scattered here. But the reason they were heading for the coast may have been because Franco had a secret deal with Germany where they were refueling German submarines during the war on this coastline, and particularly apparently out of Ferrol. So this is more or less exactly where we were. So although it's thought none were refueled in 1943, the last was done in 1944, there were 25 or 26 altogether. It's possible that's why they were making a dash for the coast when they were damaged after being attacked. And the Spanish Civil War comes into our storyline at this point as well, as we head into the little town of Praia de Estero. Sorry, this isn't the town, this is the estuary. So this is the estuary at the bottom of the Cape. That particular boardwalk detour, in fact, saves you I don't know, it's probably 10 kilometers or more of cycling, because the roads don't connect through at this point. You have to do a much longer trip around this. But yeah, so we're coming into the town that's at the base of the Cape, and in 1936, the beautiful iron bridge that was built here in, I think it was 1906, was the last of the estuaries to get spanned by a bridge, was used as an execution site by the Francoists, where basically they murdered trade unionists and leftists. I haven't found a number, but it was probably quite a large number in that first summer of 1936, and their bodies were then dumped in the river. So every year now there's an anniversary commemoration held at just beside the bridge there to mark those murders. The opening weeks of the Spanish Civil War basically saw the Francoists murdering absolutely huge numbers of people in the territory they'd managed to seize, and a lot of the bitterness and length of the Civil War that followed was down to those murders, because people knew what would happen to them and their relatives once the fascists captured the areas they were in. And of course then there was a lot of retaliatory killings of fascist prisoners in the big prisons once the fascist army started approaching those particular cities. So no escaping the particular grim history, and of course Franco getting into power was part of the reason why he was able to do that submarine refueling for the Germans. And despite all that, after the war, he basically makes a deal with the Allies. He joins NATO, and part of that deal, and this is a particularly grim bit, is that a lot of Spanish Republicans, socialists, anarchists, trade unionists fled to France, and then of course the Nazis took France, so some of them ended up in camps there, but others joined the Free French Army, so that the first units of the Free French Army that liberated Paris, that arrived in an armoured armoured personnel carriers, half-tracks, had the names of famous Spanish battles as the names of those vehicles, and the reason for that is they were Spanish Republicans and anarchists who had joined that army. Now, the anarchists in particular used their service in the Allied armies to basically get guns, both stealing Allied ones and German ones, burying them with the intention of, after the war, coming into Spain to settle the struggle with Franco. But as part of that deal with Franco, the Allies provided names of those people to Franco, so most of them were captured very, very quickly and executed in turn. So yeah, the particular Spanish Civil War background through cycling in Spain keeps coming back. It's quite hard to actually find any history of it. It's still very much suppressed, and it's really only now that there's a movement of memory that in particular is seeking the mass grave sites and the execution sites and trying to ensure those are actually remembered as coming to the fore, but it's relatively little online in terms of specifics. So that execution site on the bridge and the earlier story about the rail line coming out of Santiago were the only two I have discovered to date, but there could well be more as I get further into this trip. The total climbing distance of today's cycle seems a little bit surprising, except when you actually look at the terrain. Look out there at all those headlands coming up, because basically what I ended up doing as I was going along the coast was going up and over a series of ridges in turn. I think probably about 4 significant ones. The advantages of doing this route up the ridges, though, is that meant you got on nice quiet roads, including those logging roads going through the eucalyptus forest, whereas once I started to come back down towards the coast again, although the road hogging the coast is obviously a bit flatter, it also meant you were on much more high traffic, and also, it has to be said, a lot more boring roads. I mean, often when I'm talking about this, I talk about the not particularly liking the traffic nature of this sort of thing, but actually it's also true that they're just much less scenic and atmospheric, and it's kind of, I think if you're into speed cycling, these would probably be the roads to stay on more, because you're obviously going to be able to keep up a higher speed overall. But if you're cycling for the scenery, which is essentially is what I'm doing, these busy roads are just not the same amount of crack. However, I was coming down to another bridge and town, and also there was a nice little bit of beachfront here that I was going to get to cycle along as I was approaching it, so that made it all okay. Apparently the population of this section of the coast actually triples in summer, and cycling along here this is right at the end of May, I think, before the numbers of tourists have arrived, you can sort of see why it would be a popular destination. So we are now going to be crossing the river and approaching a bridge. Again, my usual, I hate bridges, coming up. Now this bridge itself, though, is quite interesting because it's built on the site of an older Roman bridge, but in fact it dates from, I think it's the 15th century, and particularly I think 1492 somebody dies and they leave a load of money in order to fund the building of a new bridge across the river, and it's actually built from that. The town here, which I think is called Viveiro, has an interesting festival at the start of July, the first Sunday of July most years, called the Shaving of the Mares. And so that's because in the area there's a tradition of wild horses living in the mountains. Now, they're not fully wild. It seems to be a kind of commonage type thing. We have this in Ireland with sheep, where basically in the mountain pastures you have sheep that are owned by particular people, but they're all mixed in together, are let out, and then they're identified. The owner is identified by way of colourings placed on the back of the sheep. I'm not quite sure how they do the equivalent with the mares, but that's probably what this annual festival is about, where they are all brought in once a year and they are shaved. And I think at that point the foals are also marked and deloused. So that would be an interesting one if you happen to be here the first week of July. Apparently variations of this festival on different dates are common across areas of Galicia which have a similar practice of semi-feral horse racing in the mountains. So this is getting us on the approach to San Cibrao itself, which used to build carvels back in the Middle Ages. So those are small sailing ships. But it has a very interesting festival, the Fiesta of A Maruxaina, which is the second Saturday of August. And that's related to a local legend about a siren who lives on the islands and would lure sailors to their deaths by singing. So that once a year, basically, the townspeople dress up in old traditional gear, and they assemble at noon at the courthouse, and sailors bring the siren. I presume one of them dressed up there, and the siren is then put on trial, and a decision is made whether she is good or bad. And an interesting aspect of that is there's a homemade alcoholic strong drink called Queimada is served, which apparently has its origins in Celtic festivals in the area. It's a punch made from the fermented remains of grapes and vines, so a bit like a grappa, I guess. The grappa is the Italian version, with sugar, lemon peel, and oranges, and coffee beans. Now, I've had a version of this from, I suspect, further south of in Galicia, called Café Core, I think it is, and it's quite an interesting thing to drink because all the caffeine in it is very good for keeping you up at night. So I can sort of see why it would be popular in festival terms. Any of you familiar with Buckfast? It's basically a version or a drink that does something very similar to Buckfast, but tastes very much more pleasant. While they're preparing this, it's described as a punch in the what I've read, but that's a machine translation from Galician, so I suspect it's probably not really the right word. But when they're preparing this concoction, various incantations or spells are recited over it, and then it is set alight and slowly burns as you add brandy to it. So that sounds quite an impressive set of drinks altogether, and here, as I said, that happens in the second week of August, so definitely probably a good time to be visiting the town, because I'm sure that's pretty wild altogether. So we're now just on the ridgeline above San Cibrao. So San Cibrao is a fishing port, but there is also a very big aluminium smelter there, and as we come down towards it, you'll see this chimney belching out smoke. I wondered what that was. Clearly that's the aluminium plant, and if you have a look at Google satellite view actually of this area, you'll see the bit that I'm cycling through now to the left hand side of it, which is basically approaching the town itself, though what must be absolutely enormous tailing ponds that show up as really bright red in the satellite images. You're kind of looking down at it and going, what is that bright red thing? The town itself, it's funny, it's kind of, I described it in my Instagram post. By the way, you should follow me on Instagram to get my live stuff. That's also Ebike Touring Life. I post photos from the side of the road as I travel, so it's a much better place to get an idea of where I am right now. YouTube, it always takes me a while to edit them together, but as I said in the Instagram post, I found the village a bit kind of overdeveloped, and thinking about that a bit more, because apparently it doesn't have much tourism, and my initial assumption was that was tourist cottages and things, but apparently it isn't. It's probably one of these places that has a lot of second homes, because people were from this area and then they migrated to the bigger cities. But what often happens in this case is also very true of Ireland. There is an aluminium plant of Donegal in Ireland, so they come back and they build themselves cottages and things, and the town sort of fills up with them. So it felt very quiet when I was here in early May. There were not many people around, but that's probably because a lot of those seasonal people hadn't returned. So coming up to my hotel here, which was a very cheap €35 a night, absolutely fantastic view from it, popped across the road to one of the local restaurants where I treated myself to a load of lamb chops, and then had an evening wander around the town as I prepared for day 14, when I would be heading further west along the coast before dipping down into the mountains. If you've enjoyed this video, please do give it a like. It helps me get it out to more people, and do follow the account. Read the description. I'll have a link to my route on cycle travel, so you could actually completely reproduce the route I found. They give you a GPS route you can follow on your map. And if you have any questions, comments, or you know something about the area and there are things I've missed out here, then please do leave a comment telling me that. Thank you very much for listening.